All right, chapter 21, environmental issues. Last chapter. Woo! Thank goodness. Page 462. There are some things that you need to be aware of on the environmental side, and we're going to particularly focus on environmental issues as it relates to residential transactions. That's what you will be tested on. And so I'm going to hit the items that I know for sure they have traditionally tested on that are in this chapter. The first one of those, and I love this house that they have for you on page 40. If you live in this house on page 463, please move, because this is a very unsafe dwelling that you have going on here. You have contaminated groundwater, you have asbestos ceiling tiles, you have a leaking tank under your house, got lead-based paint, carbon monoxide. Well, at least the carbon monoxide will kill you before all the rest of the stuff.
He's even got electrical issues.
That's the one thing you got going for you here. It's going to be quick and silent. You know? So, but there are some specific environmental issues that we need to talk about that you might see on a test. And obviously, anytime there's an environmental issue involved, that becomes a material fact, and we must disclose it, and you're liable for any failure to disclose, and you need to know what the rules are about that so that you don't make a mistake when it comes to disclosing these sorts of things. So, asbestos is the first thing that we want to talk about. The first hazardous substance, which is on page 463 in your book, is asbestos. Asbestos is one of those things that used to be considered a miracle substance. And it was just amazing. They used to, the ads actually touted how much asbestos things had in them because it had such great properties. It was great at friction wear, it was great at heat resistance, it was great at anti-corrosive activity. So, you know, it was put in brake liners in cars, brake drums that were lined with asbestos. The ceiling tiles in a house were asbestos tiles. How many of you have ever been into like an older home or an older business that has the square vinyl looking tiles on the floor, but they look like black or green marble? They have like that marble finish. They are asbestos-based tiles. They are almost all exclusively asbestos-based. And if the tiles weren't asbestos, the glue holding the tiles down was. It was in everything. Your pipe insulation. Some of those, the shingles on the roof would have asbestos in them. Sometimes the siding on the side of the house would have asbestos. So it can be anywhere in any building that's of a certain age. You don't need to know that age specifically. Generally speaking, 1978 is a pretty magic year for environmental concerns, and that is also true for asbestos. I don't know why they ask you about 1978 more so with lead-based paint than they do asbestos, but they were outlawed at the same time for residential purposes. The problem with asbestos is it becomes friable. You need to know that word, and that word is in your textbook on page 463 in the last paragraph down there. They don't make it bold, but it's about halfway down through the paragraph. F-R-I-A-B-L-E, friable. It means that when it starts to break down, it breaks down into tiny little microfibers and they become airborne and you can inhale them, and they inflame the lining of your lungs. How many of you have ever gotten like insulation on your arms, like fiberglass insulation? What happens? Itch like crazy. Well, imagine that to the lining of your lungs. That's what asbestos does. And those fibers, once they get in there, they never get out. And it creates continual inflammation over and over and over. And eventually leads to lung cancer, specifically called mesothelioma.
And you do not want to.
Yeah, it makes it really hard.
Right, that is a death sentence.
It makes it really hard for removal of it because, like, I'm part of the Modern Home Association. And so most of all those houses are before 1978. And it's like a huge issue.
Absolutely.
Like, if you can't contain it, it's almost better to tear it down.
Yep. So
especially if it's got lead.
Let's talk about that. That's the next thing we're going to talk about is how do we get rid of it? We talk about how dangerous it is and why it's a problem. So let's talk about how we get rid of it. And this is an example of some things that were advertised just for fun. The filters on your cigarettes. Because they actually advertised that this filter was best because it had asbestos in the filter. So if it wasn't bad enough that you were smoking, you had an asbestos-based filter on the cigarette. I think the average lifespan was about 22 years at that point in time.
Who is that? What basketball player is that?
That is Bob Cousy.
Bob Cousy.
Yeah. It says smokers are also exposed to asbestos have a greatly increased risk of lung cancer, obviously. So how do we remediate the asbestos? First of all, there are two ways. We can either encapsulate it, that's a magic word, we can encapsulate the asbestos, which means seal it off so that it can never become airborne. Okay? That's one. The second way is to remove it. Here's the problem with removing it. It has to be sopping wet as it's removed. The entire area has to be wet continuously as it's removed. So think about where you're removing it from in most cases. From a home. How do homes react when you're in there with a fire hose spraying things down as you're trying to remove? It's not pretty, right? So as you say, if you can't contain it or encapsulate it, a lot of times it's more cost effective to actually just tear the entire structure down if the asbestos is breaking down. So here's where you should be very careful. If you have clients who are looking at buying an older home and they're talking about renovating it, gutting it, tearing this out, then you should have that home research for these environmental hazards like asbestos and lead-based paint, for example, because that can become dramatically more expensive and dangerous for them to demolish on their own. And it's actually illegal in North Carolina now. You won't be tested on this. It's actually illegal in North Carolina, even for a homeowner, to demolish anything in their property built before 1978 unless they've taken a class on asbestos and lead-based paint remediation. You have to, the class is free. You can go one weekend. It's 8 hours. The North Carolina Department of Epidemiology teaches it, and they will teach you how to deal with. But if you have a house built before 1978 and you want to start demolishing stuff, you got to go take the class. Okay. All right. So we want to either encapsulate or remove it. And if you remove it, it's a big, long process with a lot of water and a lot of scraping, and it's expensive. Lead-based paint is another hazard that was outlawed in 1978. You will be asked about 1978 when it comes to lead-based paint. Does anybody know what the dangers of lead in paint is?
It's kidneys, blood. Oh, we got it there. Never mind. Sorry.
Yeah, but it's specifically in what group of people?
Children.
Children, and because they eat it. There's no expression. Did you eat paint chips as a kid? You know, that's.
Tommy Boy.
I'm sorry.
From the movie Tommy Boy.
Yeah, right. Well, it's it's an old expression because it's true. And my understanding, not based on personal experience, is that lead-based paint chips are sweet. I don't know. I have not sampled, and I don't intend to anytime soon. But I think a lot of it just has to do with the fact that kids put their mouths on everything. Windowsills, unfortunately, a lot of cribs were painted with lead-based paint, and of course, kids put their mouths on the crib railings and all that sort of thing. And even if the paint's not chipping, the lead can leach into your body just from having it be in contact with your mouth, and it causes all kinds of developmental problems and issues for children in particular. The way you remove lead-based paint hazards is exactly the same way you remove asbestos hazards. It's either through encapsulation, which is easier in lead-based paint, because how do you encapsulate lead-based paint?
Paint over it.
You paint over it. That's exactly right. As long as it's not chipping, cracking, peeling, as long as it's in good shape, you can paint over it and encapsulate it, and that's fine. The good news is the lead that was put in the paint was to keep it long-lasting, so a lot of times it doesn't chip and peel, so you can simply paint over it and be okay. Or removal, but if you remove it, you get into the same process as you get into with asbestos, because the dust, it can be very harmful to people's health, and they have to wet it and all that kind of stuff. You do see this at work now in a lot of older homes if they're putting new windows in them, for example, or putting vinyl siding on the outside of it. If you go by the house, they'll have tarps all around on the ground on the outside because they legally have to capture all those paint chips. They cannot allow them to fall on the ground any longer because the lid leaches into the soil and then gets into the groundwater. So there's been lots of changes when it comes to how lead-based paint hazards are handled. So the magic year is 1978 for lead-based paint hazards. We can talk about that. Lead's more dangerous to children because they haven't developed yet, and it definitely affects their central nervous system development. Okay, skip over that. Now, the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act, which is on page 465, you need to be very familiar with from test taking standpoint. The Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act. You don't need to know what year it was passed. You need to know the magic year for lead-based paint, which is what year?
78.
1978. And by the way, on that 1978 thing, it's not 100% guaranteed if the property was built after 1978 that it doesn't have lead-based paint, and it's not 100% guaranteed that if it was built before 1978 that it does have lead-based paint. That's just the year that the federal government outlawed the use of it in residential construction, so that's the year we use for disclosure purposes. If you have a client buying a house that's built any time in the late 70s or earlier, you should be making them aware of the potential for lead-based paint in that property, because it could still, if builders had paint hanging around, they used it. Whether it was 1978 or 1980, they used it. I looked at the statistics. If it was built in 1977, it has about a 25% chance of having lead-based paint in it. If it was built in 1972, it has about an 80% chance of having lead-based paint in it. So that's the kind of critical time frame from 1972 to 1980, where it sort of really fell off very quickly. So, any time in there, you might want to be concerned about it. Anything older than that is almost 100% going to have lead-based paint. If it was built in the 60s or earlier, it certainly has or had lead-based paint in it at one time. Okay? Now, this Disclosure Act, or Reduction Act, requires a disclosure statement. Okay? Any residential property that's sold in the state of North Carolina, and actually in the United States, that was built prior to 1978 requires a lead-based paint disclosure statement. Now, it works almost exactly like our residential property disclosure statement does. Y'all remember we talked about the residential property disclosure statement earlier in class, and we talked about it this past Sunday in the review as well. What's the key to the residential property disclosure statement? Does the seller have to disclose anything?
No, only if they know it or if it's a possibility.
Well, they don't need, if they know it, they don't have to disclose
They
it.
can't lie about it.
They can't lie. They can always say what? No representation. Okay? The same thing is true of the lead-based paint hazard reduction form. They're not under any obligation to disclose. It's simply saying, yes, we do have knowledge that there's lead-based paint, or no, we don't have knowledge that there's lead-based paint. And if we do, here's what we know about it. Okay? So they're never required to actively find out if they have lead-based paint and disclose it to somebody. All right? It's just not what the form requires. The form basically says this property was built prior to 1978, therefore it might have lead-based paint, and here's what we know about it. Most of the time, what do they put on there? Do they know? Nothing. They do the Sergeant Schultz routine, and I know you young people don't know what that means, but that's okay. He knows nothing. Yes, ma'am.
To remove it, would that be a buyer's expense or a seller's expense?
Depends on what they negotiate. I mean, there's no set rule about that. It would be a negotiation, the buyer might ask the seller to do it. The seller could obviously easily say no, and the buyer would have the right to do what?
Back out.
To back out. That's exactly right. And that would be true of anything with that due diligence contract. As long as they're in their due diligence period, they can always terminate the contract. Now, specifically with lead-based paint, there is a separate time period for inspections that gets triggered here. 10 days. Okay? If the property was built before 1978 and is a residential property, not only do you have to give the buyer this disclosure form, you have to offer them a 10-day inspection period so that they can evaluate the property and decide if it does have lead-based paint or if it doesn't have lead-based paint and what they want to do about that.
So if they decided within this 10-day period that they don't want the property, do they get their due diligence back?
If it's because they find lead-based paint, yes. They would have to actively find lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards. So the only way it would actually get their due diligence back for them is if they had the inspection done, the inspection revealed lead-based paint, and they terminated for that particular reason, then yes, they would get all their money back. So that if it's built before 1978, it's residential, they get a pamphlet called Protecting Your Family from Lead in the Home. You don't need to know the name of that, but they get that pamphlet, and they get the disclosure statement, and they get 10 days to inspect the property. That's if they're buying it or leasing it. A tenant also gets the same 10-day period to inspect the property. So the North Carolina program, which I put a little note up here about, the North Carolina program basically requires anybody, including a do-it-yourself person, to go be certified and take the class, and if you're not, you can be fined up to $750 a day.
Do we need to know that figure?
No.
Okay.
All right, that's all you need on lead-based paint. Page 466, radon. Radon is a colorless, odorless, tasteless gas that causes lung cancer. The good news is, it's in this room right now. Y'all hold your breath. It is always around us. It is a naturally occurring gas. It emanates from the ground. It comes from the natural breakdown of uranium. You don't need to know any of that for the test. You need to know it's odorless, colorless, tasteless, causes lung cancer. It is not considered to be harmful unless it's in high concentrations. Now the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, does not set a safe level. That's a misnomer. People say, okay, the EPA safe level is this. The EPA actually says there is no safe level of radon. What the EPA sets is a level where they say it ain't safe anymore, for sure. That's their action level, which is 4 picocuries per liter. You don't need to know what a picocurie is either. You just need to know that that level for recommended action is 4.0 picocuries
So
per
when
liter of air.
you're selling your home and the inspector does this, or
Yeah,
you do it
usually
yourself
they're
from Lowe's or
different
whatever.
inspection, or you can get a test kit from
Right,
Lowe's.
and it sits in the house or whatever.
Yep.
So the only action, the only time there would be a problem if it's 4
Or above.
above.
That's usually when people would want some sort of remediation done. And remediation is very simple when it comes to, it's actually one of those ones that's pretty simple to fix. So that's why you should always have it tested and make sure it's not there. They install a fan, basically. Depending on the type
For
of
$800,
construction.
they
Yeah.
install a fan.
Right, yes, which is relatively cheap when compared to lead-based paint or something like that. But it depends on the type of construction. If it's a crawl space, the fan goes in the crawl space. If it's a slab, the fan will go on the side of the house and it sucks air from underneath the slab and evacuates it out the top. The problem with radon is not that it's naturally occurring, it's that these structures tend to concentrate it. The more we seal up structures, the more we tend to concentrate radon. There's actually a huge uranium deposit right underneath Capitol Boulevard, so properties that flank Capitol Boulevard on either side tend to have very high radon levels. Just FYI, you might want to have those checked if you ever see one. Like the stuff like Brentwood, you see some 15s and 16s over in Brentwood. And just to give you an idea, I asked somebody from the EPA once, I said, what does a 15 mean? Because that number didn't really mean anything. He said, it basically means you're a 3-pack-a-day smoker as far as cancer risk goes. So yeah, that ain't sounding too good to me. So I would say if you have a 15 or 16 radon level, get it remediated. That'd probably be a good thing to do. And the reason, I guess, is it's such a big risk because you're breathing it all the time.
Oh, you're constant.
You know, it's constant. And so it's not, obviously it's not as harmful as smoking would be, but you don't smoke 24 hours a day, whereas you do breathe 24 hours a day. Okay? Ventilation will usually resolve the issue. There's a map of radon areas, not that you really care. Generally speaking, the more exposed rock you have, the more you have a radon problem. So places like Asheville have much more serious radon problems than we do. The clay around here tends to effectively sort of barricade it off.
Is zone 1 more severe in that, or is zone 3?
Zone 1 is more severe. So all up here in the Rockies, for example, very severe radon. But you also see down the Appalachian Trail here. And then there's that, yeah, I don't know if you can really see that. You might have to turn the lights off to see it. But there's one red-orange little finger right there. That's the one under Capitol Boulevard. It sort of stretches down into central North Carolina. And it's almost directly under That's another thing not to like about Capitol Boulevard. There's a bunch of uranium.
There's a
under
bunch
there.
of stuff not like
Yeah,
Capitol.
as if you needed more.
Exactly. I saw a picture the other day of Capitol Boulevard at the 401 split and taken in like 1962, and there was literally like 3 houses in sight and nothing else. I was like, whoa. I mean, that's only 50 years ago. It's just crazy that that's changed that much. And so there's the North Carolina map, and you can see that little finger there. Okay. Radon you, again, put a fan in. Here's one example of a radon fan that's in an attic, and it vents out the top of the house, and that pipe probably goes all the way down to the crawl space, so it essentially just changes the air from the crawl space to the outside without it ever actually making it into the house.
And if the company who is testing your radon is going to remediate your radon, you can guarantee they are going to find.
Oh, they're gonna
some
find radon, of course, yes, absolutely. Yes, most of the testing companies do offer remediation, so I would suggest having two separate entities do those services. Yeah, it's like taking your car to the dealership and going, is there anything wrong with it? Does it need to be fixed? Yes, lots. Urea formaldehyde, don't worry about it, you're not gonna see it on the test, okay? Carbon monoxide, you might see on the test. Again, odorless, colorless, tasteless. It does all the wonderful things that radon does, just a lot faster. Radon takes a long time to kill you. Carbon monoxide does it real quick like. Very dangerous stuff. I know I make light of it, but it's extremely dangerous. Any open flame in the property presents a carbon monoxide danger. Also, any property that has an attached garage presents a carbon monoxide danger because of cars left running in garages, particularly now cars with remote starts. That is, we've already had 2 deaths in Raleigh in the last 3 years as a result of people using remote starts with their car in the garage and their bedroom being located above that garage, and they died. We've had 2 deaths in Raleigh as a result of remote starts being used. People starting their car in their garage. That's not a good idea because of carbon monoxide. If the property has any sort of an open flame in it or an attached garage, it should have a carbon monoxide detector. And that's actually the law now in North Carolina. If you're going to be renting out homes, if there's any open flame, so for example, gas water heater, gas stove, wood burning fireplace, gas logs, you name it, if there's an open flame anywhere in that property or an attached garage, it must have a carbon monoxide detector installed. And folks, just as a note, don't buy the combination ones. They don't work. The combination smoke detector, carbon monoxide detectors do not work because if you open them and read the instructions, it says to maximize carbon monoxide detection, place no more than 18 inches from the floor because carbon monoxide is heavy and it settles. You read the further instructions. To maximize smoke prevention, place on the ceiling or in an elevated area. Well, how am I supposed to do both? Yes, the detector may pick up both, but you can't put it in both places. So just get a standalone carbon monoxide detector, and it should be close to the floor, not above the level of the bedding. It's supposed to be below the level of the bedding so that the alarm goes off before you're dead. Doesn't do much good for it to alarm after that. Okay? Other hazards. You don't need to know about any of those except underground storage tanks. So we're going to talk about those for just a second. The whole electromagnetic radiation thing has pretty much gone away. I don't know of anybody who's too concerned about that any longer. I think everybody gave up on that with the advent of cell phones. There for a while, people were very concerned about electromagnetic fields causing cancer, and of course now they walk around with an iPad on their head, and they don't care about it anymore. So that's largely gone away, and they don't test it on really anymore. But underground storage tanks, they do talk about. This is a huge issue. It's going to be a huge issue when you get in the real world practicing. You must test for these underground storage tanks. If you're selling a property that's in an area where there's even a remote chance that there's an underground tank buried in that yard, there are companies who will go out and who will look for that. And you need to be recommending to your clients, have the yard checked for an underground storage tank. Because folks, they are going to be legally liable for whatever is under that ground once they buy that property. There is a lady who lives on Crabtree Creek here in Raleigh who had a visit from the EPA 2 years ago. She got a knock on her door, and there were 3 people from the EPA. The EPA had been brought in by the North Carolina Department of Natural Resources. The North Carolina Department of Natural Resources was there because somebody had called the game warden and said, I'm fishing on Crabtree Creek and I see a sheen of oil. And so they went out and they investigated, and sure enough, there was a sheen of oil. And they followed it back to this lady's property. And what they found was that she had an underground buried number 2 fuel oil tank, which is heating oil from when the house was built. She had no earthly idea that she had this tank buried because she had only owned the house for 4 years. She is legally responsible for the contents of that tank and the fact that it was leaking, and it had not only leaked into the ground, but it had made its way into Crabtree Creek. Who do you think got the bill for that cleanup?
We should.
You know what that bill was?
Probably them.
$297,000.
Does she not fall into that? I know there's some, I only know a little bit about this because of my grandparents, but not knowing you had it, is she?
Doesn't exist anymore.
Okay.
They have, the super fund has been defunded.
Okay.
Yes, there used to be protection for homeowners who could prove that they had no knowledge and no way of knowing, and that's largely been eliminated now, because basically the response now is there are enough companies who will test for this thing that you should have had it tested when you bought the property.
This
So
was years ago.
what I'll say to you is if you're selling an older home, if it's more than, say, 30 years old, have the yard tested for underground storage tanks. There's a company in Raleigh that charges $125 to do it. And they will go out and they will check the entire yard and they will give you a guarantee that there are no underground tanks there. And if your client doesn't do it, that's okay, but you should be recommending it. And that way you have the email, so when they get the $290,000 bill down the road and they come back and try to sue you, no. $125, I tried to get you to spend to go look for it, and you do not want to do it. My one
Calculate the gain and loss percentage on that.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, because if you have a problem with this, it's going to be a huge, massive expense problem. I mean, this is not anything to play around with. You know, if they're going to spend $400, $500 on a home inspection, they should certainly spend $125 on something that could cost them drastically more than any problem with the house could. You know, because these tanks are there, and they're, in a lot of cases, they were just abandoned when people stopped using them, and they still have fuel oil in them, or gas, or whatever else they were storing in these things, and obviously over time they leak. If you have one that hasn't leaked, it's not so bad. And the way they test to see if they've leaked, FYI, if they find one, they will test it to see if it's leaked. What they will do is pump it out, they will empty it, they will wash it, get it all cleaned out, and then they pressurize it. They put air pressure on it. They come back in 24 hours, and if the air pressure is holding steady, that determines that the tank has never leaked. And so therefore they just cap it off, fill it with gravel, they don't even take it up. They just fill it, because they've already cleaned it out, they've already emptied it and washed it out. They just fill it with gravel and dirt, cap it off, and you never have to do anything else. It costs a few $100 and you're done with it. If they come back and it's lost pressure during that time period, now it's got to come out of the ground, because they have to see if the soil around it is contaminated. And they have to keep digging until they get the soil that's not contaminated anymore. To give you an idea of how much that can delay things, you know the Charles Schwab that's down here by Crabtree? How many of you have seen that? Well, there was a gas station that was there, and they tore that gas station down, and that lot sat empty for about 5 years. Well, that's pretty valuable real estate. The reason it sat empty was because their tanks had leaked there, and it was so ungodly expensive for them to excavate that it took years before they could find an investor who was willing to come in and pay for that on that lot. So that just gives you an idea of how expensive this process can be with these underground storage tanks. My funny story about an underground storage tank is I was showing a property one time to a client, and their kids were playing football in the backyard while we were walking around looking, and one of the kids disappeared. The tank had deteriorated so much that when the kid ran across it, it collapsed and he went in it. Luckily it was empty, and luckily he didn't get hurt, but that's pretty scary when you're standing there like, where did he go? And you hear him screaming and he's not there anymore. Yeah, right, exactly. Somebody's in the well. And of course the parents are looking at me like, I'm like, no, I don't have a playbook for this one. Sorry, this is off script. I don't know. You're on your own here. I don't know what happens when your kid falls in the tank. All right. So make sure you're checking for these underground storage tanks. You don't need to know the gallon limits of and all that stuff that's on page 470 to know the ones that are exempt. Just know that they are a big deal. You should be looking for them. You should be disclosing them. Let's see, what else?
So if you decide to sell commercial,
Yep.
and you know the place has ever been a gas station,
Yep. Have it checked. have soil samples taken. They come out and do core samples where they drill down and they'll look at it and make sure there's no contamination. That's up huge, because once you buy the property, you bought the property. Fleas come with the dog, right? And once you own it, you own all of it. So yes, it's a huge deal, huge deal. All right, mold. Mold has become a little bit of an issue in that there are some toxic forms of mold, and I think people are more sensitive to the existence of it now, and they're checking more often, and they're finding it more often. A couple of things to recognize about mold. Number one, not all mold is toxic mold. There is going to be mold, particularly in the crawl space of most homes that have any age to them at all. And even home inspectors will tell you that mold itself is not evidence of anything unless it's in excessive amounts or if it's specific kinds. That doesn't make you an expert on mold. If you notice mold or see mold, you should point it out to your client and have them evaluated if they're concerned about it. Because if it is toxic mold, that can be ridiculously expensive to get rid of it. You have to change all the HVAC systems, the duct work, all of that has to go if it's established that you have toxic mold, because those mold spores get into all the air circulation systems in the house.
Yeah, one of my clients does it. They make really, really good money.
I'm sure.
And if you have a tenant that wants to keep her air conditioning lower than the dew point, you're almost guaranteed to have mold in your ductwork.
Oh,
Hey
I'm
now,
sure.
hey now.
What is she keeping on, 50 degrees?
No, 62.
62.
Woo!
And
65 to
it cost us
62.
$6,000 to remediate the mold.
62? How does she afford to pay the bill?
65 to 62,
I
yeah.
don't know.
I could keep mine on 62. It would never achieve it, but I
would never make it.
It would just run 24 hours.
And my drainage line would
I live,
just be.
I live in a 1975 ranch. You could not cool it to 62 in the wintertime. You know, it's like, there's just no way. All right. So it is not a material fact just because there is the presence of mold unless it's in excessive amounts or in unusual locations. If it's inside, that's an unusual location. I had somebody one time say, oh, well, there's not much of it. I said, well, where is it? Well, you can just see it on the sheetrock kind of poking through the paint. Yeah, that's a problem. Should not be there. Unusual locations means anywhere other than the crawl space. How about that, right? Crawl space, you might expect to see some. It's damp down there. But there shouldn't be a lot of it even there. And all those black dots, it's not mold, that's cricket poop. All right, that's what that is. First time I learned that, I was fascinated by that. Really, that's what that is. That is not good. And that is a picture I took years ago. Not wearing a mask, I might add. Smart, right? I'm like, oh, let me go back in here and take a picture of this. Meanwhile, I'm doing this, I can help, right?
Sure.
Yeah, that's really helpful. That is a property that's about to implode. When it starts to look like that, that means the mold has reached a point of critical mass where, and the only reason this one had not pretty much imploded yet was this was wintertime, and so it was fairly dormant because the house was, you know, it was a foreclosure house, and it was cold in there, but once spring and warm temperatures hit that, that's gone. You pretty much have to demolish that. There's not much you can do about that. Okay? CERCLA, basically, that is the law that set up the guidelines for cleaning up these environmental issues. That's what you need to know about it, is that it's the law that governs the cleanup of these environmental issues. It's enforced by the EPA, and that landowners are generally held responsible for cleaning up what comes from their property. I am not going to spend any time on these North Carolina environmental issues because I think you can read the name of them and decide what they govern. The North Carolina Mountain Ridge Protection Act. It has to do with the mountains, folks. The North Carolina Leaking Petroleum Underground Storage Tank Cleanup Act. Guess what that deals with? So those are pretty self-explanatory, and it's about the only thing you would ever see on a test would be, you know, which of the following is not, you know, an environmental concern in North Carolina, and it might say something that you've never heard of, and that's the one you'll choose. Okay?